If you're anything like me, you've probably spent the last few years waiting and hoping for a dungeon crawling experience that actually makes you feel as though you're inside of a dungeon, facing off against ghouls, ghosts, and goblins of all types. And you, my friend, are in for a treat. Dungeonborne is a game that is frankly quite similar to another game of the same genre, called Dark and Darker. Let's be real, it's the first thing that everyone thought of when looking at the game. It's a fair comparison to make, and it's the comparison that most people who would be thinking of buying a game like this want to hear about. So, before we talk about anything else, let's discuss and compare the two games. First of all, I'm pretty sure most people will agree that Dungeonborne is the better of the two games. From enemy variety to the flow of combat itself, Dark and Darker fails to stay fresh, and this new iteration on the formula seems to succeed where its predecessor kinda seems to be failing. With abilities that lack for relevancy, items and equipment that provide little more than minimal stat increases, and shops that are spread out across multiple different tabs, forcing you to go to 3 different NPCs each time you return from a dungeon in order to sell all your items. The treasurer takes coin, the collector takes treasure, and the equipment merchant takes equipment you might not want anymore. Not to mention having to go to different shops each time you want to buy equipment, because all of them are separated, with each class having to go to up to 3 different NPCs just to check if there's an item that they'd be interested in, and 3 other NPCs for consumables, because, my fighter wants to wear a gambeson, so he goes to the tailor, but then he wants a sword, so he goes to the weaponsmith, but then he wants potions, so he goes to the potion guy, and then he wants bandages, so he goes to the bandage guy. It's too much. Meanwhile, Dungeonborne's singular merchant not only looks really, really good, but she also sells items for all classes, buys all the items you'd like to sell, and also sells consumables. What I'm trying to say is Dark and Darker lacks for a lot of quality of life improvements that the newer game has in spades. Regarding gameplay differences, Dark and Darker's combat is almost exclusively defined by who applies the most immediate pressure to their opponent in a melee, or who can get the first hit in when it comes to magic. With incredibly slow movement, especially for the melee dedicated characters, and clunky attacks, it becomes painfully difficult for players to become accustomed to the combat, especially as the game lacks a way for players to practice combat without fear of losing their resources. Any player attempting to play the dedicated melee classes, such as Fighter or Barbarian, will quickly learn that they will almost always lose to another player unless they get the first strike, creating a cycle of frustration that is only relieved once you inflict that same frustration on another player, thereby perpetuating the cycle. Conversely, Dungeonborne's more developed combat system allows players who excel in melee to close the gap against ranged opponents reliably, and even dispatch melee ambushers that attempt to get the jump on them, making for a far more satisfying experience, especially when you manage to defeat someone with better equipment or in an overall better position than you were when the combat started, simply because you were the better player. While character abilities and class customization in Dark and Darker is by far more numerous, it's unfortunate that very few of these abilities actually matter unless you already have a significant material advantage from having high-level equipment. The passive skills give you a little more than minor statistical improvements, and the active skills are either barely relevant or have an extremely limited number of uses for the entire dungeon, which really curbs their usefulness. In Dungeonborne, however, passive abilities are unlocked by increasing your base attributes of strength, dexterity, stamina, will, intelligence, and faith to specific breakpoints in order to gain massive perks. Now, this is done through either acquiring equipment or simply leveling up your character, and each passive significantly improves your character's performance, adding a layer of strategizing to what equipment you wear that is simply not found in any other game of its genre that I know of. Some examples of these passives are the fighter, who has the ability to become immune to friendly fire with a high enough will, or the Death Knight, with the ability to heal each time something dies within their vicinity with a high enough stamina. There's 6 passive skills per character, and 2 active skills, and in all cases, these skills are incredibly relevant. When going into a fight against another player, one of the most important things you need to do is establish your enemy's class based on gear and playstyle. Otherwise, you might get blindsided by an ability, which will immediately lose you the fight. as well as your entire haul. At the same time, it's critically important to know when and how to use your own abilities to their biggest effect. Just as the fighter's whirlwind ability can win you a fight, it can just as easily lose it if your opponent blocks your attack in its entirety and responds with their own attacks while you're still recovering. It doesn't matter how hard that fireball hits if you just get out of the way, or if you manage to close the gap and cut down the mage who wanted to throw it at you. At the same time, all the classes feel reasonably powerful, while retaining a good identity. Mage classes are easy to kill, but dangerous when ignored. Agile classes are quick and can get in and out of a fight fairly quickly. However, if you get one or two hits in on them, they're sure as hell gonna feel them. And warrior classes are strong, damn near unbeatable in a melee, but they do struggle keeping up with the more fast-paced characters, and they need to know how to close that gap. Although I will say this, the Cryomancer has the ability to freeze you in place while continuously dealing damage to you, and it becomes very unfun to deal with because it's an ability that is relatively hard to avoid because it has such a large area of effect on top of slowing you each time it deals damage to you. So once you get hit once by the ability and it continues to hit you over time, it's almost impossible not to get frozen unless you kill the Cryomancer fast enough. This feels almost like an oversight, that you can still take damage while frozen, because the rogue has a similar ability to petrify a target, but can't follow it up with a big damaging hit. With regard to itemization and loot, in Dark and Darker, most of the loot you acquire will be from chests or the dungeon itself, as the enemies you fight are strong, but not numerous enough to provide the lion's share of your haul. This is equalized in Dungeonborne, however, with there being far more enemies for players to fight against, and loot, on top of far more loot found in chests, breakable jars, and simply lying around the map. With these major facets of comparison out of the way, I want to talk about Dungeonborne itself, and my own personal experience, and what I most enjoyed about the game, and the classes that I played. One of my current favorite classes is the Death Knight. Now, this could be because I'm a sucker for a good skeleton in armor, sure, but I also really enjoy the unique mechanic of the undead classes, which allows them to feed off of the souls of anything that dies around them to use both as a source of power and healing. I love a good melee powerhouse, and the Death Knight fits the bill perfectly. But before that, I played the fighter, and he has to be my favorite by far. When I tell you that this is one of the very few times where the melee warrior class is given some proper love, I mean it. The two abilities that this class has are both incredibly good. A quick dash for mobility and a powerful whirlwind attack that forces enemies to go on the defensive or be killed on the spot. Means that most of the time, if someone's talking about fighters, it's to complain about them. All while ignoring the fact that other classes deal similar damage far more safely. The only class in the game that feels slightly underpowered in a head-to-head fight would be the rogue. But honestly, if you have the ability to go invisible and then sneak behind me and apply non-consensual acupuncture to the meat around my rectal cavity anytime I stop paying attention to you, I'd say you deserve it. The enemies, I love the enemies. I love the enemies. I love the simple yet effective design on each enemy and how it makes you very quickly understand exactly what to expect from each enemy as soon as you encounter them. I said each a lot. If an enemy is large and lumbering? If an enemy is large and lumbering, you can probably dance around them easily enough. But you don't want to get hit by them, or you'll die quickly, if not immediately. If an enemy is short and quick, you immediately know that you can bully them around easily enough, but you want to watch out for his 15 friends, or you'll be the one getting bullied. And if you're planning to take down an enemy that is marked on your map, you better know what you're doing, or the only thing getting taken down is you. Speaking of enemies that are marked on the map, defeating these guys is easily one of the most fun and rewarding things to do when it comes to the adventures. You need to be careful, precise, watch out for their individual attacks, and make sure you don't get caught out of position, all while slowly chipping away at their rather large health pools until they decide it's time for their forever nap. Or you can just get two mage friends to demolish it from afar while you loot all of the valuables. In terms of the elites, there's Wolf Dude, Axe Dude, Goat Dude, Ghost Dude. And in terms of bosses, you got One-Eyed Willy and this fucking thing. I've managed to kill almost all of these, by myself or with friends, except for Goat Dude and the Wendigo, which is this guy. Scary fucking guy. The closest I got to killing Goat Dude, I was attacked by another player and killed instantly, only for that same player to immediately be killed by the giant goat monster that frankly should have been his main concern. Which kind of brings me to the next topic, and what I'm pretty sure is a decision that has held back other games of this type, and one I can guarantee will hold this one back as well. I cannot stress this enough. I genuinely and truly believe that if this isn't something that the devs consider, it will severely shorten the game's lifespan. Most people don't look at this game as a battle royale in the same vein as Fortnite, PUBG, or Apex Legends, although that's definitely one facet of it. The reason people are drawn to this game is because of the existence of a hostile threat aside from the other players who are also exploring the dungeon. This means that on occasion, people will want to focus exclusively on fighting the monsters of the dungeon without having to worry about other players getting in their way. As is, we already have an arena mode which, in all fairness, is incredibly fun. It allows you to gear up with blue rarity items, that's this tier, and fight other players without fear of losing any of your gear, so you can go wild with your class, enjoy yourself without fear of consequence, and get a better idea of what your character is really capable of. I think it'd be a universally positive addition if they were to give players a way to fight exclusively against the dungeon. Whether this be in a dungeon delve setting with even harder monsters than the other dungeons, or, tiers like first floor is easy, second floor is a little bit harder, third floor is really hard, and the fourth floor is just nothing but elites, boss monsters. If you go here and you don't know what you're doing, you are going to die and lose everything, especially if you have to go through the other three floors first. Or they could even do something like the arena, but specifically for PvP. A horde mode where three players face off against ever increasingly difficult hordes of enemies. Even if there's no actual reward outside of this other than just bragging rights, and maybe even a leaderboard. This, of course, shouldn't be done to the detriment of the players who actually want to fight other players. They're the target audience for this type of experience, and I understand that. And I think every one of us understands that, and every one of us enjoys participating in that every once in a while. But having the option to go into a dungeon without having to worry about anyone else getting in the way, especially somebody who's been playing the game for longer because, they have more time on their hands, or they're just more dedicated to the game, and that's okay. But I don't want to have my own enjoyment curbed by someone that I have absolutely no chance against. I'd also like to note that the trio dungeon is significantly more rewarding than the solo dungeon, without necessarily being all that more challenging, with the exception of the elites, which are noticeably stronger, and players, which are far more numerous. I've noticed that I get a lot more items of green rarity, or higher, that's this one, from killing monsters in the group dungeon, while the only real danger there is getting attacked by a group of three players that saw me and my friends before we saw them. Meanwhile, I've spent hours doing solo dungeons only to almost never encounter good gear drops, let alone anything above the lowest rarities. It feels as though the game incentivizes players to socialize by starving them of the items they want if they don't, rather than simply letting players choose what type of content they want to consume. This will only damage the game's popularity in the long run, as players who enjoy group content become more and more powerful, and those who prefer to play by themselves remain weaker than them by default, and a rift forms in the community, with both sides resenting the other and considering themselves above them. I think it'd be best to leave it up to the player to decide what sort of content they want to enjoy, whether that be solo, group, PvP, or PvE content, while still providing them the opportunity to jump into the other forms of content without first having to go through a hazing period. With all that being said, I can feel this game's potential with every delve, so I expect there will be a lot more improvements to come. At the time of this recording, the live test is on its last day. I played this game a lot throughout the past week, and I really enjoyed it. And I hope that I'll enjoy it even more when it fully comes out, or in future live tests. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it, especially all the way through to the end. Absolute legend. Thank you for 170 subs. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.